The sound wasn't the wind, and it wasn't an animal. It was human, a thin thread of panic pulled taut against the heavy summer air. Finn reined in his black horse, the gelding shifting under him, sensing the tension. He scanned the shimmering surface of the lake, his eyes narrowed against the glare. Then he saw it. A disturbance in the water, a flash of dark fabric, a hand breaking the surface and vanishing again. He didn't hesitate. He swung down from the saddle, his boots hitting the dusty bank with a thud, and ran toward the water's edge. The horse stood, patient and still, as if it had seen this kind of sudden, grim purpose in its rider before. He hit the water in a shallow dive, the cool shock a welcome antidote to the oppressive heat. He was a strong swimmer, his movements economical and powerful, cutting through the murky water toward the spot where he'd last seen the movement. He surfaced, gasping, and heard the sound again, closer now, a choked sob. A woman. Her head broke the surface a few yards away, hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide with terror. She was wearing a simple gray prairie dress, now heavy and dark with water, pulling her down like an anchor. He reached her in 3 strokes. "Easy now," he said, his voice low and calm, a stark contrast to the chaos of her struggle. She flailed, her hands grabbing for him, for anything solid in a world that had given way beneath her. "Sir, help me," she gasped, the words swallowed by a mouthful of water. Her hand found his arm, her grip surprisingly strong, the desperate clutch of the dying. He turned her, getting an arm securely around her chest from behind, lifting her head clear of the water. "Stop fighting me. I've got you. Just breathe." She coughed, water spewing from her lungs, her body shuddering with a mix of cold and shock. He started the slow, arduous swim back to shore, her dead weight a burden he was grimly accustomed to carrying. He felt the soft mud of the lake bed under his feet and dragged them both out of the water, collapsing onto the grassy bank. She lay there, shivering violently, curled on her side as she coughed up the last of the lake. Finn stood over her, dripping and breathing hard, his shadow falling across her. He was a man who preferred to keep moving, to ride past trouble, not dive headfirst into it. The scar that cut through his left eyebrow seemed to tighten, a permanent reminder of the last time he had failed to mind his own business. The woman pushed herself up onto her elbows, her long black hair clinging to her cheeks and neck. She was young, maybe 25, with features that spoke of a land far from this sun-scorched territory. She looked up at him, gratitude and fear warring in her dark eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw. He just nodded, his gaze already drifting back to his horse, to the open trail, to the idea of leaving this moment behind. "What were you doing out there?" he asked, his tone flat, betraying no curiosity, only a weary sense of obligation. She followed his gaze to the water. A small waterlogged basket floated near the reeds. "The watercress," she said, her voice trembling. "It grows thickest there. I slipped." A fool reason to nearly die. He didn't say it, but she saw the judgment in his posture. He offered a hand. She hesitated for a second, then took it. His grip was rough but steady, and he pulled her to her feet as if she weighed nothing. Her gray dress was ruined, clinging to her form, and she wrapped her arms around herself, shivering again, though the sun was hot enough to bake clay. "I have to get home," she said, more to herself than to him. He saw it then, the deep exhaustion in her that went far beyond a near drowning. It was a weariness of the bone, a tension in her shoulders that spoke of a long, losing fight. He knew that look. He had seen it in the mirror often enough. He let out a slow breath, the sound of a man surrendering to a battle he hadn't wanted to join. "Where's home?" he asked, the words feeling like stones in his mouth. She led him away from the lake, her bare feet leaving damp prints in the dust. His horse followed without prompting, its reins held loosely in his hand. Her home was less than a mile away, a small homestead huddled against a low rise, looking tired and brittle under the vast, indifferent sky. The fence was a line of leaning posts held together by hope and rusted wire. The vegetable garden was meticulously kept, a patch of defiant green in a landscape of brown, but the barn door sagged on a broken hinge, and the whitewash on the house was peeling away in long, sun-bleached strips. It was a place holding on by a thread. A woman's voice, frail and laced with worry, called out from the shaded porch. "May, is that you?" The young woman, May, raised a hand. "I'm all right, Auntie. I'm coming." She turned back to Finn, a faint blush of shame on her cheeks at the state of her property. "This is it." He said nothing, his eyes taking in the details. The patched roof, the worn-out broom by the door, the single milk cow looking on with placid disinterest. This wasn't just poverty, it was a slow, grinding siege. He tied his horse to a solid-looking fence post, the only one for 20 yards. An elderly woman, her face a road map of hard years, appeared at the doorway, leaning on a cane. Her eyes, sharp and suspicious, fixed on Finn. "Who is this?" "He helped me," May said quickly. "I fell in the lake." The aunt's suspicion softened into alarm. She shuffled forward, her hand reaching for May's arm, her touch both a comfort and an inspection for injury. "The water is a treacherous thing. I told you." "I'm fine," May insisted, though her shivering had returned. She looked at Finn, the obligation to offer hospitality warring with a clear desire for him to just disappear. "I can offer you a meal. It's the least I can do." He was about to refuse, to mount his horse and ride on until this place was just another memory blurring in the heat haze. But he saw the way she stood, straight and proud amidst the decay, and the way her aunt watched him, like he was another predator circling their small, vulnerable world. He was tired of being seen that way, even if it was often true. "I'll take a cup of water," he said, "and I can fix that barn door for you before I go. It's an easy job." The offer hung in the air, unexpected. May stared at him, trying to understand his motive. In her experience, men like him, drifters with hard eyes and competent hands, never offered help without a price. "Why?" she asked, the single word blunt and direct. Finn shrugged, looking at the sagging door. "A door that doesn't close properly lets in things you don't want." It was a practical statement, but it landed with the weight of a proverb. He wasn't just talking about coyotes. Inside, the home was spare but immaculately clean. While the aunt busied herself, May finally explained the true nature of the siege. Her father had died a year ago, leaving the deed and a mountain of quiet trouble. A man in town, a Mr. Sterling, held a note against the property. "He says my father missed payments," she explained, her voice low and tight. "He produced a ledger showing a debt. He wants the land, the water rights mostly. His ranch is upstream, but this plot has the best access to the aquifer." A hearing was set. In 10 days, a circuit judge would hear Sterling's petition for foreclosure. If she couldn't produce proof of payment, or the full amount of the alleged debt, she would lose everything. "I know my father paid him," she said, her hands clenched in her lap. "He was meticulous, but I can't find his records. They vanished after he passed." Finn listened, his face impassive. It was a common story, the powerful swallowing the weak, using the law as a knife. It was the kind of fight that left good people broken and buried. It was not his fight. He drank his water, the silence stretching between them. "I'll fix the door," he repeated, standing up. "Then I'll be on my way." The next morning the sun rose hot and fierce, bleaching the sky to a pale, washed-out blue. Finn was already at the barn, his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and tanned by years of sun. He worked with a quiet, efficient rhythm that was mesmerizing to watch. He wasn't just slapping a repair together. He was resetting the heavy door, shoring up the frame, his movements precise and certain. He worked as if the task itself was the only thing that mattered in the world. May brought him a tin cup of coffee. She had changed into a dry, faded blue dress, and her hair was tied back, revealing the determined set of her jaw. She watched him for a moment, the sound of his hammer echoing in the still morning air. He was a paradox, a man who seemed so intent on leaving, yet whose hands were building something solid, something meant to last. "You didn't have to do this," she said, holding out the cup. He stopped, taking it from her. Their fingers brushed, a brief, unremarkable contact that felt strangely charged. "It's better than being idle," he replied, his gaze fixed on his work. He drank the coffee in 3 long swallows and handed the cup back. "The wood in this frame is rotting. It'll hold for a while, but it needs replacing." "I know," she said, her voice tight with a familiar frustration. "It's on a long list." He went back to his work, and she stayed, not speaking, just watching. After a while she went to her own tasks, weeding the garden with fierce, angry pulls, as if each weed were a stand-in for Mr. Sterling. An unspoken truce settled over the small farm. They worked in their separate spheres, but they were aware of each other, 2 solitary planets now caught in a fragile, temporary orbit. Later that day he moved from the barn to the fence line, digging new post holes and stretching the wire taut. It was back-breaking work under the relentless sun, but he never slowed. He seemed fueled by a deep internal fire, a need to impose order on a chaotic world, even if it was just 1 fence post at a time. May brought him lunch, bread, cheese, and a piece of dried apple. They ate in the thin shade of the barn, sitting a few feet apart. The silence between them was no longer tense, but companionable. "You're good with your hands," she observed. He grunted in response, not taking it as a compliment so much as a statement of fact. "My father was a carpenter," he said, the admission surprising them both. It was the first piece of his past he had offered. "He taught me how to build things, how to make them right." "Did you build things with him?" she asked, her curiosity piqued. A shadow passed over his face, brief but profound. "For a while." He stood up, the meal finished, the moment of connection severed. "Fence won't fix itself." He walked away, leaving her with the distinct impression that he hadn't just been a carpenter's son. He had been a man who built things, and somewhere along the way something had been irreparably broken. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in shades of purple and orange, the work was done. The barn door hung straight and true, closing with a satisfying thud. The fence was no longer a suggestion, but a clear, solid boundary. Finn was washing his hands at the pump, the cold water splashing over his face and arms. May came and stood on the porch, watching him. "Thank you," she said, and this time the words carried a different weight. It wasn't just gratitude for a service rendered. It was an acknowledgment of the care he had put into the work. He looked up, water dripping from his chin. For the first time, his gaze held a hint of something other than guarded distance. He saw the strength in her, the stubborn resilience that kept this place from crumbling into dust entirely. "Get some rest," he said. "You look like you need it." It was the closest he could come to expressing concern, a gruff, practical kindness that was more genuine than a dozen flowery speeches. He knew he should leave. The job was done. But the image of her struggling in the water was burned into his mind, and the specter of the foreclosure hearing, now just 9 days away, felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. Leaving now would feel less like moving on and more like running away. The rhythm of work and shared silence continued for 2 more days. Finn found other tasks, small but necessary repairs that he undertook with the same focused intensity. He reshod May's milk cow, repaired the handle on the well pump, and cleared a stubborn patch of rock from the field she hoped to plant in the fall. He never said he was staying, he just didn't leave. They spoke little, but a language of action grew between them. Her leaving a fresh pail of milk for him at dawn was a conversation. His sharpening her hoe without being asked was a reply. They were like two wary animals learning to share a territory, their trust built not on words or promises, but on the quiet evidence of mutual competence and respect. On the third day, a rider appeared on the horizon, a dark speck growing steadily larger against the shimmering heat. It wasn't a casual visitor. The rider moved with an air of official purpose, and May's posture stiffened as she watched him approach. Finn stopped his work, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his axe, his stance casual but ready. The man was a deputy, his badge a dull star on his vest. He was young, with a face that tried for authority but settled on arrogance. He reined his horse in at the fence line, not dismounting, a subtle assertion of power. "Miss Lee," he said, his eyes flicking from her to Finn with open suspicion. "Mr. Sterling sent me. Just a courtesy reminder about the hearing. 7 days now." "I'm aware of the date, Deputy Nash," May replied, her voice cold and even. Nash's gaze lingered on Finn. "Got yourself some help, I see. Didn't take you for the kind to hire on drifters." "He's a friend," May said, the lie coming to her lips with surprising ease. It felt true in a way. Finn's presence had become a quiet shield against the crushing weight of her isolation. Nash smirked, a condescending twist of his lips. "Friends in this part of the country can be liabilities, especially when they have no stake in local affairs. A man with nothing to lose can cause a lot of trouble." The threat was as clear as if he'd drawn his pistol. He was warning Finn to move on, warning May that harboring an outsider would only make things worse for her. Finn didn't say a word. He just stared at the deputy, his expression unreadable, his stillness more unnerving than any angry retort. There was a coiled danger in him that Nash, for all his bluster, seemed to recognize. The deputy's smirk faltered. "Just a friendly reminder," he repeated, his tone losing some of its swagger. "Mr. Sterling is a generous man, but he expects his accounts to be settled. Punctually." He tipped his hat with false politeness, wheeled his horse around, and kicked it into a canter, raising a cloud of dust that drifted over the newly mended fence. May watched him go, her shoulders slumping as the adrenaline faded, leaving behind a cold residue of fear. "He's trying to scare me," she whispered. "He's trying to scare you away." Finn turned back to the woodpile, lifting his axe. "Men like that are only brave when they think you're alone," he said, and brought the axe down with a sharp crack, splitting a log in two. His words were a simple observation, but for May they were a revelation. He hadn't said, "I won't be scared away." He had said, "You're not alone." The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but for the first time in a year it was accompanied by a flicker of something else, a fragile, dangerous spark of hope. The deadline was no longer an abstract date on a calendar. It was a living threat, and it had just shown its face. That evening the air was thick with unspoken tension. The deputy's visit had shattered the fragile peace of the homestead. The ticking clock was deafening now. After a sparse supper of beans and cornbread, May began a desperate, almost frantic search through her father's belongings. She pulled out an old sea chest from under her aunt's bed, its contents a jumble of her family's past. Faded photographs from a distant homeland, embroidered silks, a few leather-bound books in a language Finn couldn't read. She handled each item with a kind of reverence, her search for a legal document becoming a painful excavation of her grief. "He kept everything," she murmured, her fingers tracing the spine of a book. "Every receipt, every letter. He believed in the power of the written word. That paper was a promise." Finn watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, his presence a silent vigil. He felt like an intruder on her sorrow, yet he couldn't bring himself to leave her to face it alone. The search grew more frantic. She emptied drawers, sifted through papers in a small writing desk, her movements becoming jerky with rising despair. "It's not here," she finally said, her voice breaking. She sank onto the floor, surrounded by the ghosts of her father's life. Sterling must have taken it. When he came to offer his condolences, he must have. It was possible. A man who would use the law to steal land would have no qualms about stealing the one piece of paper that could stop him. The hope that had flickered earlier was dying, smothered by the weight of Sterling's corruption. Finn pushed himself off the doorframe. He walked not to her, but into the main room, his eyes scanning the simple, worn space. His gaze fell to the floor, to the wide pine planks that had been there for decades. He noticed one near the hearth that sat just slightly uneven. A carpenter's eye saw things others missed. He knelt, pulling a small knife from his pocket, and worked the tip into the seam. He pried gently, and the board lifted with a low groan. Beneath it was a small, dark cavity, a hiding place, and nestled inside was a metal lockbox, coated in a fine layer of dust and grime. May looked up, her tear-filled eyes widening in disbelief. She crawled over as he lifted the box out. It was heavy, solid. The key was not in it. He always said to hide what was most precious," she whispered, her mind racing back to her father's cryptic words. "He must have hidden the key separately." She scrambled to a small framed portrait of her parents on the mantelpiece. With trembling fingers she unfastened the back. Taped to the cardboard was a small, ornate brass key. It fit the lock perfectly. With a click, the box opened. Inside, there was no dust. The contents were neatly arranged. On top was a heavy vellum document, the original deed to the property, signed and sealed, with a clear addendum detailing the water rights, and beneath that was a thin ledger book. May opened it, her breath catching in her throat. It was her father's hand, the script precise and elegant. Page after page detailed payments made to Mr. Sterling, with dates, amounts, and notes. The final entry, dated just a week before his death, was marked, "Paid in full." But it was the last few pages that changed everything. They contained meticulous notes on other payments, not from her father, but from his neighbors, the Gables, the Petersons, others who had long since lost their land to Sterling. Her father had been keeping a record not just of his own dealings, but of the entire scheme. It was the proof. The hidden, buried truth that could not only save her home, but could unravel Sterling's entire empire of fear. The ledger was a weapon, but a weapon was useless without someone brave enough to wield it. Sterling controlled the town, from the deputy to the circuit judge who would be hearing the case. One woman's word, even with a private ledger, would be dismissed as a forgery, a desperate fiction. They needed more. They needed voices. "Mrs. Gable," May said, her finger tracing the name in the ledger. "Her husband. He argued with Sterling for months. He told my father everything. Then one day he was just broken. They lost the farm a month later." Finn looked out the window toward the faint light of the neighboring homestead. "People don't like to revisit old wounds," he warned. "Fear makes for a long memory." "But this could give her justice," May insisted, her own fear now eclipsed by a surge of righteous anger. "It could give them all justice." The next morning they walked to the Gable farm. It was smaller than May's, the land clearly suffering from neglect. Martha Gable, a woman who looked 10 years older than her age, met them on the porch. Her hands were stained with dirt from a meager garden, and her eyes were filled with a deep, settled weariness. When May explained what they had found, showing her the entry with her family's name, a flicker of something ancient and painful ignited in the woman's eyes. It was anger, long buried under layers of shame and resignation. But then the fear returned, stronger than ever. "He'll ruin us," she whispered, looking over her shoulder as if Sterling himself might materialize from the fields. What little we have left, he'll take it. He'll say we're liars, conspirators." "He'll do that anyway, sooner or later," Finn said, his voice quiet but firm. "Men like him don't stop. They just find their next target." Mrs. Gable shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "I can't. My husband, it would kill him to go through that again, to be shamed in public. I'm sorry." She retreated into her house, closing the door with a soft final click. The sound was one of defeat. They tried another family mentioned in the ledger, the Petersons. A tenant farmer named Samuel Peterson worked a plot on the edge of Sterling's vast ranch. He was a big man with a wife and a perpetually worried expression. He listened to them, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the horizon where Sterling's prize cattle grazed. "Sterling owns the land I work," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He owns the roof over my family's head. If I speak against him, we'll be on the road by morning with nothing but the clothes on our backs. I can't risk it, not for a piece of paper." He wasn't hostile, just pragmatic. His fear was a cage built of responsibility, and he saw no way out. They returned to May's farm as the sun began to dip low, the ledger feeling heavier than it had before. The truth was not enough. Without corroboration, it was just a story. Despair began to creep back in, a cold, familiar fog. "They're too afraid," May said, slumping onto the porch steps. "He's made them too afraid to even hope." Finn stood beside her, looking out at the land she was fighting for. He understood the fear. He had spent years running from his own ghosts, choosing the safety of anonymity over the risk of connection. He saw the same impulse in these farmers. They had retreated into their own small shells of survival, believing isolation was safety. "Fear breaks one person at a time," he said, thinking aloud. "Maybe courage does too. You just need to find the first one." That night, as he did a final check on the property, he noticed something. A set of fresh hoof prints near the back of the barn, leading away toward the open range. They weren't his horses. Someone had been there, watching, unseen. The warning from Deputy Nash had not been the end of it. It was just the beginning. The attack came 2 nights later, under the sliver of a new moon. Finn was woken not by a sound but by a smell. Acrid smoke, sharp and invasive. He was on his feet in an instant, pulling on his boots, his mind clear and cold with purpose. A flickering orange light danced against the window pane. He burst out of the small room he'd taken over and saw May already at the main door, her face a pale mask of horror. "The barn," she breathed. He didn't need to be told. He grabbed 2 empty grain sacks from beside the door and ran to the water pump, shouting over his shoulder, "Stay in the house! Lock the door!" He worked the pump handle furiously, drenching the sacks, the rhythmic squeak of the mechanism a frantic heartbeat in the night. The northwest corner of the barn was on fire, flames licking up the dry, aged timber, threatening to consume the entire structure, and with it, the hay, the tools, the single milk cow, the very heart of the farm's viability. He ran toward the blaze, the wet sacks heavy in his hands. The heat was a physical blow, driving him back. He fought it, beating at the base of the flames, smothering them, his arms and face scorched by the intense heat. It was a desperate, primal battle against an enemy that consumed everything it touched. He worked with a grim, focused fury, his world narrowed to the fire, the smoke, and the rhythmic slap of wet burlap against burning wood. Slowly, painstakingly, he began to gain ground. The flames retreated, hissing and spitting from the main wall. He was choking on the smoke, his eyes streaming, but he didn't stop. Behind him he heard a shout. He risked a glance and saw a figure running toward him, silhouetted against the distant lights of another farm. It was Samuel Peterson, a shotgun held loosely in one hand and a bucket in the other. He didn't say a word, just ran to the pump, drew water, and joined the fight. A few minutes later, another figure appeared. Mrs. Gable, her face streaked with soot, carrying a heavy horse blanket. She had seen the glow in the sky from her window, a terrifyingly familiar sight. The three of them worked in a desperate, synchronized silence, a small, determined army against the destructive force that had been sent to terrorize them. Together they beat the fire into submission. It died with a final, resentful hiss, leaving behind a charred, smoking scar on the corner of the barn and the stink of kerosene in the air. They stood there, panting, chests heaving, their faces black with soot in the pre-dawn light. The immediate danger was over, but the true meaning of the night's events was just settling in. This was Sterling's answer to their search for witnesses. It was a message written in fire. Peterson looked from the burned timbers to May, who had emerged from the house, her aunt huddled behind her. His face, usually a mask of worried pragmatism, was set in a block of cold, hard rage. He hefted the shotgun in his hands. "He tried to burn you out," he said, his voice rough with smoke and fury, "just like he threatened to do to my family if I didn't sign the new lease agreement. This is the end of it." Mrs. Gable, who had been staring at the damage, her expression one of haunted memory, finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the morning air like glass. "My husband didn't just break," she said, her eyes finding May's. "Sterling broke him. He threatened us. He told everyone my husband was a drunk and a cheat. No one would help us. No one would even look at us. I stayed silent then. I won't stay silent again." The fire had been meant to isolate and terrify May into submission. Instead, it had forged a coalition. It had pushed two frightened people past their breaking point. The fear was still there, but now it was overwhelmed by something stronger, the certainty that if they didn't stand together now, they would all burn alone. The day of the hearing arrived with a heavy, oppressive heat that promised a storm. The small town hall was packed, the air thick with the smell of sweat, dust, and nervous anticipation. Mr. Sterling sat at the front next to his lawyer, looking perfectly composed in a dark, respectable suit. He nodded at acquaintances, a benevolent patriarch bestowing his favor. He was the picture of civic virtue. May sat at a small table opposite him, Finn standing just behind her chair. She looked small and out of place, but her back was straight, her hands resting calmly on the ledger in front of her. Samuel Peterson and Martha Gable sat in the first row of benches, their faces pale but resolute. The circuit judge, a man named Ferris, with a florid face and eyes that carefully avoided meeting May's, called the room to order. Sterling's lawyer presented the case with brisk efficiency. He produced a ledger of his own, showing a clear debt against the Lee property. He spoke of Mr. Sterling's patience, his generosity, and his reluctant need to finally settle the account. It was a smooth, practiced performance. Judge Ferris nodded along, his expression sympathetic to Sterling. "Miss Lee," the judge said, his tone already dismissive, "do you have a response to this claim?" May stood up. Her voice, though not loud, carried through the silent room. "I do, Your Honor. I have my father's ledger, showing the debt was paid in full." She pushed the book forward. Sterling's lawyer scoffed. "Your Honor, a private, unverified document? It's meaningless. A forgery, no doubt, created out of desperation." Sterling smiled faintly, a flicker of condescending pity. "It's a sad thing, Judge," he said smoothly. "Grief can make people do regrettable things." The judge picked up the ledger, glanced at it, set it down as if it were contaminated. "Miss Lee, without official records from the land office to corroborate this, I'm afraid this is just—" "The records were removed," May said, her voice rising with controlled anger. "By him." She pointed at Sterling. A gasp went through the room. Sterling simply shook his head, a picture of wounded dignity. "This is slander," his lawyer boomed. Judge Ferris banged his gavel. "That is a serious and unsubstantiated accusation. I will have order. Based on the evidence presented by Mr. Sterling, I am prepared to rule—" "Wait!" a voice called out from the gallery. Samuel Peterson was on his feet, his knuckles white where he gripped the back of the bench in front of him. "She's telling the truth." A murmur swept through the crowd. Judge Ferris's face purpled. "You are out of order, sir. Sit down." "No," Peterson said, his voice shaking but growing stronger. "I won't sit down. I won't be silent any more. A week ago, Mr. Sterling's man, Deputy Nash, told me that if I didn't agree to new terms on my lease, terms that would put me in his debt forever, I'd find myself on the wrong side of a property fire. And 2 nights ago, Miss Lee's barn was set on fire." The room erupted. Nash, standing by the back wall, went pale. Before the judge could regain control, Martha Gable stood up, her frail body trembling. "My husband, Thomas Gable, paid Mr. Sterling in full for our land. I saw him count the money. The next week, Sterling produced a different ledger and a foreclosure notice. When my husband protested, Sterling ruined his name in this town. He called in debts, spread lies. We lost everything. I was too afraid to speak then, but my silence was a sin, and I will not carry it to my grave." The testimony of 2 respected, long-suffering members of the community shifted the very atmosphere in the room. Doubt began to poison the air of certainty around Sterling. He was no longer smiling. His composure was cracking. Then, a final, unexpected blow. A small, mousy man at the back of the room stood up. It was Daniel Finch, a clerk from the land office. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold his hat. "They're right," he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Mr. Sterling, he paid me to misplace certain files, to alter the official copies. He said it was just correcting clerical errors." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small packet of papers. "These are the original payment receipts. I couldn't bring myself to burn them. I kept them." He walked forward, his eyes fixed on the floor, and placed the documents on the judge's bench. The room was utterly silent. The paper promises May's father had believed in had finally been honored. Sterling was on his feet now, his face a mask of fury and panic. "Lies! All of them! This is a conspiracy!" But no one was listening to him anymore. They were looking at the receipts, at the faces of their neighbors, and seeing the truth they had all been too afraid to see for years. The law, so long a weapon in one man's hand, had finally been turned back toward justice. The hearing ended in chaos. Judge Ferris, his complicity now exposed to the entire town, hastily postponed the proceedings indefinitely and fled the town hall. Mr. Sterling, for the first time in his life, was met not with deference, but with the cold, angry stares of the people he had systematically exploited. His power had always been rooted in their fear and their silence, and in one afternoon both had been shattered. He wasn't arrested that day. His influence was too deeply embedded in the county's foundations for such a swift and clean resolution. A federal marshal would have to be called in from the state capitol to conduct a proper investigation, a process that would take months, if not years. But something fundamental had changed. The foreclosure on May's land was stopped, the evidence from the clerk irrefutable. Sterling's reputation, the most valuable currency he possessed, was left in tatters on the floor of the town hall. He had been publicly unmasked, and the web of intimidation he had so carefully woven for years had begun to unravel. In the days that followed, a quiet transformation took place. The tide of public opinion, once so easily manipulated by Sterling, had turned. People who had previously crossed the street to avoid May's gaze now stopped to offer a quiet word of support. Samuel Peterson discovered a basket of fresh bread and eggs on his porch one morning, left by an anonymous neighbor. Martha Gable, who had lived in shamed isolation for years, found herself invited for coffee by women who had once shunned her. The fear hadn't vanished entirely, but it was no longer absolute. People started talking to one another, sharing stories in low voices over fence posts and in the general store. Other ledgers were compared, other memories unearthed. The community, fractured by suspicion and fear, was slowly, tentatively, beginning to heal itself by speaking the truth. Finn watched it all from the periphery. He helped Peterson reinforce his fence and accepted a quiet handshake of profound gratitude. He saw the new light in Mrs. Gable's eyes, the lifting of a burden she had carried for too long. He saw the change in May. The constant, weary tension in her shoulders had eased. She smiled more, a genuine, unguarded expression that transformed her face. He had come to this place a drifter, intent on passing through, on not getting involved. He had seen a problem, and his first instinct had been to ride away. But he had stayed. He had fixed a door, then a fence, and then, piece by piece, he had helped mend a broken community. The scar above his eye no longer felt like a brand of failure. Standing behind May in that courtroom, steady and silent, he had finally understood. Redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about building a better future, one right action at a time. He had failed to save someone once, a long time ago. He hadn't failed this time. And that, he realized, was a kind of peace. Weeks turned into a month. The fierce heat of summer began to soften into the golden light of early autumn. The charred timbers on May's barn had been cut away and replaced with fresh, sweet-smelling pine. It hadn't been just Finn's work. Samuel Peterson had shown up one Saturday with his 2 strong sons, and other neighbors had followed, contributing lumber, nails, and labor. The barn raising became an unspoken celebration, a communal act of defiance and renewal. Finn found he no longer thought about the trail ahead. His days fell into a comfortable, meaningful rhythm. He worked the land with May, their movements synchronized, their silences filled with an easy understanding that ran deeper than words. He was no longer the haunted drifter, and she was no longer the woman under siege. They were partners, rebuilding a life from the foundations they had fought to protect. He never spoke of leaving, and she never asked him to stay. The question was irrelevant. His presence was woven into the fabric of the place now, as solid and essential as the new barn wall. One evening they sat on the porch, watching the sunset, painting the sky in strokes of fire and rose. The air was cool and clean. His black horse grazed peacefully in the pasture, a permanent fixture in the landscape. "My father would have liked you," May said softly, breaking the comfortable silence. He believed a man's worth was in what he could build and what he was willing to protect. Finn looked at his hands. They were calloused and stained with the honest dirt of the farm. They were carpenter's hands again. For years they had only been good for holding reins, for moving on. Now they were hands that had repaired, defended, and rebuilt. He thought of the man he had been, the man who ran from connection, who believed attachment was a weakness that led only to pain. He had been wrong. He was a wise man, Finn said. It was all the acknowledgment she needed. Her hand found his on the bench between them, her touch light but sure. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of quiet solidarity, a recognition of the journey they had taken together, from the desperate struggle in the lake to this moment of earned peace. He didn't pull away. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. The future was uncertain. The fight against Sterling's remaining influence would be long. But for the first time in a very long time, Finn wasn't looking at the horizon for an escape route. He was looking at the woman beside him, at the home they had saved, and he felt the unmistakable, unfamiliar sensation of being exactly where he was supposed to be. He was home.